Okay, good morning. I am delighted to welcome you to day 2 of Confronting Racial Capitalism, the Black Radical Tradition and Cultures of Liberation. My name is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I'm the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, and also a professor in the PhD program in Earth and Environmental Sciences here at the Grad Center. We had a very lively panel yesterday afternoon, followed by an intense plenary last night, and we're delighted to begin our second day of conversation with a panel this morning, another this afternoon in the same room at 2 o'clock, and finally the closing plenary back downtown at NYU at 6:30 p.m. So I want to do the requisite thanks for the live streaming and tell you that apparently the live streaming is working now, and live stream is, I put the link on my Facebook page, so if you're my Facebook friend, you can find the link. You can sign in to the GC email if you want to tweet. The GC email, you go to settings in your phone or whatever and select GC guest, and you have to put in your email address and click I agree and you're in. You will never get an email from the GC email account. If people are live streaming, this is not very helpful since I'm not telling them what the link is. You have to find the live videos on it. We do have a hashtag if you're tweeting, which I've never done ever in my life. And the hashtag is #RacialCapitalism14. I want to thank the people with whom I organized this event. We started talking about it last year in October. It took that long and that much work, and they are Jordan Camp and Christina Heatherton. And they brought it to me. I get up and talk first, so people think I'm the first prime mover of all things. It's not true. Many, many people have made these days possible, most notably Mary Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Deborah Cowan, who's a professor at the University of Toronto in geography, who's not here today, who made an enormous gift to endow the Neil Smith Visitorship, which is funding an enormous chunk of our costs. Other sponsors are the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics here at the Grad Center, the Department of History at NYU, Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, NYU, Committee on Globalization and Social Change here at the GC, the Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and Caribbean here, CUNY Graduate Center Advanced Research Collaborative, and the CUNY Graduate Center Africana Studies, and the PhD program in Earth and Environmental Sciences, and finally, an anonymous donor from UCLA. So we also have had many, many fantastic volunteers, other people who have worked on this project throughout its long gestation. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to this morning's moderator, Ani Mukherji.
Good morning, and welcome back to our shared work of confronting racial capitalism. I'm sure we all wish we could start every morning that way. I'm Ani Mukherji. I'm a visiting professor of American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the moderator for this morning's panel, Anti-Capitalist and Anti-Colonial Encounters. To start, I'd also like to thank the organizers, Ruthie, Christina, and Jordan. I'd also like to thank all the people who have convened at this conference. I was thinking about Ruthie's attentive reading of Raymond Williams and Tradition and the work of choosing one's ancestors. And I'm humbled and excited and maybe more than anything, nourished to be in the presence of so many people who have introduced me to or deepened my engagement with this chosen ancestry, from Du Bois, James, and Wright, to the activists of the ILD, to Ella Baker and Essie Robeson, George Padmore, Frantz Fanon, and an interesting set of prisoners in Leavenworth. But I'll heed the cautions from yesterday and keep things short. Our panel this morning considers in the carefully chosen words of the organizers, the culture and politics of anti-capitalist traditions that emerged from anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. That is, our focus will be on the anti-colonial traditions that confront racial capitalism, rather than on the facile variants of anti-colonialism that circulate in popular culture and the scholarly world, these variants that often protest only particular imperial excesses rather than the system. Our organizers were also wise, I think, in the selection of our three speakers today, whose work has addressed the specificities of anti-colonialism in the particular context of British, French, and American empire, but also necessarily plotting this work in a broader global set of relations, what we can call the world of racial capitalism. Their fine-grained historical writing corrects and speaks to a couple of things that Elizabeth Robinson mentioned in her talk yesterday, the impoverishment of human history and how to provide a window to a better world. Our first speaker will be Hakim, who is a reader in the history of Africa and the African diaspora at the University of Chichester, UK. He has written widely on the history of Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora in Britain, including 3 history books for children. His most recent book is Pan-Africanism and Communism, The Communist International, Africa and the Diaspora, 1919 to 1939, about which he'll be talking about today. It's a deeply researched and wonderful book, I'll add. Françoise Vergès is currently Chair Global South at the College of Global Studies, Paris. She grew up in the French post-colony of Réunion Island in a communist and feminist family. She has lived in Algeria, France, Mexico, England, and the United States. Before getting her PhD at University of California, Berkeley in 1995, she was a journalist and an editor in feminist publishing, as well as an activist in anti-racism and anti-imperialism in France. She has published on the memories of slavery, Frantz Fanon and Mrs. Eyre, the Post-Colonial Museum, Colonialism, and the Politics of Emancipation. She did not mention her book, Monsters and Revolutionaries, in her biography, but I will. It's a brilliant work on race, decolonization, and the meaning of liberation. And it's also, I think, a really keen meditation on memory and historical method. I strongly recommend it. Our final speaker today will be Danny Widener. Danny began his political life at the Echo Park Silver Lake People's Child Care Center. It has been pretty much downhill ever since, according to him. Along the way, he has worked politically with the Venceremos Brigade, Community in Support of the Gang Truce, CISPs, the Friends of ANC, Roots Against War, and the Labor Community Strategy Center. He teaches history to make ends meet. He also did not mention his book, Black Arts West, but I will mention it and strongly recommend it for reasons I think will be clear after he speaks today. With that, we'll start off with Hakim's talk.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope everybody can understand my accent. Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, yeah, they will be coming later, thank you. I would like to thank Ruthie and her team for inviting me. I understand I have very limited time, so I won't thank too many people now. Maybe I can thank some other people later. But I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to you this morning about the subject of my new book, or latest book, Pan-Africanism and Communism. It attempts to, perhaps I can say, refute the idea that there's some divide between the concerns of Africans, people of African origin globally, and the ideas, the movement for the liberation of all human beings. And it looks at a particular moment, we can say the period between the two wars, which was the period of the Communist or Third International. And this morning I'm going to start with just by mentioning something about the Communist International itself, which was formed in 1919. And just to explain that, both the formation of the Communist International, which was the organization of communist parties internationally, and the victorious Russian Revolution itself of 1917 had a profound impact on the struggle of Africans globally. Of course, when we talk about a black radical tradition. We're talking about a global tradition, not an American tradition, a global, international African tradition. So these two events, the overthrow of capitalism in one country, the formation of this new revolutionary organization, had a big impact on Africans globally, Africans in struggle globally. In addition, the ideas which inform the Communist International, which came out of the Russian Revolution, which are perhaps most closely associated with the gentleman with the slightly receding hairline in the picture, the idea that the struggles of people in the colonial areas are just as important, if not more important in some instances, than those in the advanced industrial countries. This analysis of imperialism was especially important for those in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. There was no longer any hierarchy of struggle internationally, but one international struggle against what today we call the imperialist system of states. So this analysis, this moment in history following the First World War had a profound impact on many. You're probably aware of the visit that W.B. Du Bois made to the Soviet Union in 1926. When he returned, he said, "If this is Bolshevism, then I am a Bolshevik." Others were impressed too. And again, if you look at the writings of Langston Hughes, who traveled widely in the Soviet Union in that period, he also records his admiration for what he saw. And of course, he associated himself with the struggle with the communist movement in the US thereafter. But most importantly, this new revolutionary politics, this new development of Marxism in the conditions of the 20th century had a profound impact on a number of organizations. I don't have time to mention all of them. One you'll be familiar with, you can just about see if you've got very good eyesight, the publication of the African Blood Brotherhood, which was based here in New York, and was particularly inspired by events in Russia and by the foundation of the Communist International. And many of its members gravitated towards the communist movement in the early 1920s. One of the most prominent of those members was Claude McKay, the well-known Jamaican writer and poet, who you see here addressing the fourth Congress of the Communist International in Moscow in 1922. At that Congress, he was joined by another important individual, Otto Huiswood, who was one of the founders of American communism, we can say, one of the founders of the communist movement in this country, and was a key player at the Fourth Comintern Congress when the question of the liberation of Africans internationally was discussed in a particularly significant way. I should have pointed out the question was brought to the attention of the communist movement, initially I think by Lenin himself, and thereafter was taken up by various key players, including many African communists. When I use the word African, I mean people of Africa and of the diaspora. Otto Huiswood was one of them. At this Congress in 1922, he chaired a special commission on this Negro question, which for the communist movement and for African communists didn't just relate to the US, but to the movement internationally. At that time, the communist movement decided that this global question was a key revolutionary question to be solved. They considered it in a, we can say, a Pan-Africanist way. That is, it was a related question. The liberation of Africans in America, the Caribbean, Africa, Britain, France, Germany, wherever, was a related question. Different aspects of a similar question, but a related issue, which needed to be taken up by the entire communist movement. It was taken up in various ways in different countries, and I can't go into all of them now. One of the key players in France was this gentleman, Lamine Senghor, a former combatant in the First World War who joined the French Communist Party in 1925 and then led the founding of this organization that you can see, perhaps, if you're very fortunate, the Comité de Défense de la Race Nègre, which was we can say, a Pan-Africanist organization made up of those from Africa and the Caribbean, but linked with the French Communist Party. Senghor and others attended, and in fact he played a key role in the founding conference of the League Against Imperialism, held in Brussels in 1927, under the auspices of the Communist International. And he a picture of the Negro Commission of that Congress, which again considered this whole question of the liberation of Africa and Africans internationally. The Comintern itself established its own committee to take up this question, particularly under the pressure of African communists who were concerned that various communist parties were underestimating the importance of this question and not pursuing it vigorously enough. The International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers was established in 1928, excuse me, and again you can see from the symbolic representation of this organization, it was concerned with the global liberation of Africans. It published a monthly bulletin throughout the 1920s and 1930s in French and in English, which had a significant circulation internationally. Of course, it was illegal in the colonial countries in Africa and the Caribbean and was smuggled to them in various forms and various ways. In 1930, the communists who were concerned with this question organized, perhaps they've forgotten, Pan-African gathering in Hamburg, and where some 17 delegates from countries all around the world assembled to discuss the question of the liberation of Africa and Africans. Perhaps the main point to say about this question was that, of course, the Communist International took it up from a revolutionary perspective. That is to say that liberation would come through struggle, through the organization of working people in particular, and also, of course, in unity, the unity of working and oppressed people internationally. This was an extremely important development in terms of what at this event we're calling racialized capitalism. The question of racial oppression and so on. We can say that the communists of that period took this question up in the context of struggling for the, not just against, or struggling for the rights of all. Thereafter, the International Trade Union Committee was based in Germany, in Hamburg, under the direction of James Ford, who some of you will be familiar with, who is on the left of this picture. The gentleman on the right is an African communist called Garan Kouyaté, who came from West Africa, from Mali, and who was active in France, Germany, and elsewhere. The committee then was under the direction of George Padmore, you no doubt be familiar with, who in 1931 wrote a very significant work on the life and struggle of Negro toilers, again taking up this question of how Africans could liberate themselves from racial colonial oppression internationally. Thereafter, when the Nazis came to power in Germany and the Trade Union Committee had to work, it was under the direction of Otto Huiswood and his wife, Hermine. Of course, the way in which this question was taken up in various countries differed, and I haven't got time to go into all of these, the nature of this orientation in individual countries. You'll probably be most familiar with the situation in the US, so I don't need to dwell on that. But of course, the question of racialized capitalism and its oppression was taken up as an international question. Here we have a photo of William L. Patterson, and who was, amongst other things, very closely connected with the Scottsboro campaign in the 1930s. Again, you will be familiar with that, I'm sure. But that was also a campaign that was taken up internationally by the communist movement. Here is a picture of Ada Wright, the mother of two of the young men who were sentenced at that time, appearing in Glasgow in Scotland. And she, in fact, toured most of Europe. And her tours were particularly important in some ways for promoting the concerns not just in relation to Scottsboro, but of the struggles of Africans in various countries of Europe. In South Africa, the struggle against racial oppression and for liberation took again, a particular form, and the African communists, alongside the communists of all countries, developed particular policies to deal with the problems which confronted the struggle there, as well as the problems which confronted the Communist Party in that country, which was one of the few countries in Africa where a Communist Party existed before 1945. Again, I don't have time to go into it now, but if people are interested, I can say more during the Q&A. One of the key figures in that struggle in South Africa was Johnny Gomez. Again, I can say more about him later. In the Caribbean, again, the communists played a key role in the struggles of the 1930s, particularly those against British imperialism, for the rights of workers, for the rights of the unemployed in the period of the Depression and so on. And Elma Francois was one of those communists. I think the first woman in the British Caribbean to be charged with sedition for her activities, a very vigorous campaigner. Again, if you're not familiar with her, I can say more later. The movement in the Caribbean had very illustrious, I suppose, individuals associated with it. One of the most prominent would be Jacques Romain, the famous Haitian poet and founder of the Communist Party of Haiti in 1934. If you're not familiar with his poems, then please familiarize yourselves with them. Another key player was Isaac Wallace Johnson, a Sierra Leonean labor activist, educated in Moscow, again, well known for his activities throughout British West Africa, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and elsewhere. Again, somebody charged with sedition for his writing, Has the African a God, in 1936. So dangerous, he was interned for the entire period of the Second World War by the British colonial authorities. Of course, being a communist in the 1930s was a dangerous occupation. That's not to say it's not dangerous today or at any other time. And I just wanted to bring your attention to André Aleker, who was the editor of a paper, Justice, in Martinique, and who was assassinated. This particular leaflet was published by his comrades in France, who were demanding an investigation into his death. Everybody knew who'd killed him, and nobody was ever charged for that crime. So in many countries, African communists were active, and their communism in this period added a new way of organizing an analysis of the problems which confronted them during this period. Of course, during the 1930s, there were a number of key international questions which needed to be taken up for solution. In this particular photo from Wales, which I've used for the cover of my book, you'll see a particular concern with the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, which was a cause célèbre of that period, and also a concern with the impending war preparations that were being made throughout Europe and throughout the world at that time. This is actually a photo from Cardiff, and there's a story in Britain that a Jamaican doctor who was living in Britain at that time went to Cardiff, which is a port in Wales, because he was concerned about the black community there. And when he came back, he said he went there, but they were all communists. And he concluded that this was the case because only the communist movement was concerned with the problems of African people in Cardiff at that time. Okay, so how can one, what conclusions can one draw from all this? I've had to, anyways, skirt through what is actually quite a lengthy book, but I think one of the interesting things about the politics of this time is, for one thing, we can say the falsification of this history. Particularly where I'm from, there is the idea that communism doesn't have anything to do with Africans. That if Africans are connected with communism, of course they've been brainwashed by various people, or they're carrying out the bidding of various other people and so on. When you actually look at the facts, you see that Africans were their own agents, their own liberators, and took up these ideas, this ideology, because they considered it was something which was going to aid in their liberation and in their struggle. If we look at some of the consequences of taking up the ideas and principles of communism, we see it had a profound influence on many. Aimé Césaire, for example, the founder of Negritude. In the period after the Second World War, the politics of the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress, with Cedric, Barbara, and I celebrated the 50th 20 years ago. We're about to celebrate the 70th. That Congress was informed by the politics of revolutionary communism, Marxism, and so on, even though Padmore and others had parted ways with the movement by that time. In fact, Padmore commented to W.B. Du Bois when he was organizing the Manchester Congress that long gone are the days where the movement needs to be informed by the ideas of university professors and lawyers and politicians. Anyway, no. He said it's a movement that needs to be based on the working people, on the masses of the people. And this came out directly from his experiences organizing the Hamburg Conference in 1930, where the key activists toured the world, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, organizing and mobilizing people for that conference. Of course, in Britain, we have those communists who are unwanted in the US. We're always happy to accept them in Britain. And this is one of the most prominent of those. She's generally presented in Britain as the founder of Europe's biggest street festival, or in various other ways, but very rarely as a communist, which is, of course, what she was throughout her life. If you're not familiar with Claudia Jones, this is a picture of her. Then, of course, we have the influence of this politics more generally on the struggle for African liberation, the influence that it had on people like Nkrumah, who particularly at the end of his life talked about the importance of the ideas of scientific socialism and so on, which many of us just consider to be another word for communism. And then we have others like Cabral, who we're going to hear about a little bit later. And then with some people, we have to wait until they die before we are told they have any connection with communism. So again, I've had to skirt through the key ideas and orientation of my book. I understand it is available from all good booksellers and even at this conference. So you're very welcome to have a look at it. And I thank you for your attention and consideration this morning. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Daniel Widener.
Good morning, everyone. I I was struck yesterday, but I'm also going to give a blanket thank you, but especially to Ruthie, Christina, and Jordan. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and excited as well. I wanted to start by telling a story. It's funny, I wasn't at the ASA, but I'm told that Rodman told people not to talk about themselves. So in a spirit of dialectics, I'm going to transform that injunction and start by talking about myself. Yesterday, the session in the afternoon, the evening, spoke briefly about ways to conceptualize the Black radical tradition. This is Bethlehem, and I want to start by telling a story. A romantic engagement took me to Palestine amidst the Second Intifada some years ago, and we did have the occasion to visit Bethlehem, and in particular, a couple of refugee camps. It's going to scroll. It's good. It's good. Yeah. It's cool. It's cool. Anyway, we were on our way from one camp over to Dehesha, and we passed this building that was about the size of Washington Square Park, and it was completely destroyed. And I said to the man who was driving us, I said, what's that building? He says, oh, that was the jail. It was built by the British, and they jailed my grandfather. And then the British gave it to the Jordanians, and then the Israelis seized it from them. And then the Israelis locked up my dad, and then they gave it to the PA, and they locked me up. And then a couple of weeks ago, the Israelis blew it up. He says, so if anyone tells you the occupation can't do anything good for Palestinian people, and to me, that really encapsulated the spirit of what we were talking about yesterday. My talk today a little bit is about something to do with the way that labor, culture, and internationalism came together, both for people based in the United States who were on the left end, and more generally, personally for me, as Ani mentioned, I attended something called the Echo Park Silver Lake People's Child Care Center when I was quite small, and it made me into a little bit of a reactionary toddler, because what would happen is in the mornings we would come and we would sing De Colores and the International and a few other songs, This Land Is Your Land, you know, got a few regular parts of our education. And then the preschool teachers / commissars would go through our lunches and they would remove all of the candies, which would later be redistributed equally amongst all of the kids. The problem was I was pretty particular. So if I came with a chocolate chip cookie, I didn't want a butterscotch. So I would come home and I would tell my mother, don't give me anything good, just save it until I get home. It wasn't until I went to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade that I realized that I had been prepared to live under socialism since I was 3 and a half. We did, as I mentioned, I grew up initially in Echo Park, and that was a pretty specific neighborhood in the context of Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s, because there were many people there who had come out of the Communist Party. In fact, our landlord had fought in Spain. And my parents originally wound up living there because as an interracial couple, there weren't many places they could live viably in Los Angeles. This is the LA where my folks were both graduates of UCLA. And when my mother applied for her first job, which was teaching high school at Manual Arts, the principal told her, I prefer to hire people from USC because everyone at UCLA is a communist. You know, for those who were accused of being communists while at UCLA, that must come as quite a shock. In any event, my folks were not originally radicals, except insofar as that they were members of the Pentecostal church. But in the context of Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s, they became much more so. So my dad taught junior college at Compton College, and one of his students was Bruce Tyler, a man who was on the kind of younger end of the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party. And my father took his entire class with him the day that the police assaulted the Panthers headquarters on Central Avenue. And he did it. There was a lot of people came down in the hopes of preventing the police from simply massacring people in the street. My mother taught, she got transferred administratively from manual arts to Crenshaw High School, which is what we call out of the frying pan into the fire, on the eve of the 1970 strike, which created the United Teachers of Los Angeles, the teachers union, which is now led by a former Maoist comrade of mine from the Labor Community Strategy Center. So I also do want to talk about some of the radical continuities that bind us together. As a teenager, I was privileged enough to live in a city where there were active movements in solidarity with Palestine, Northern Ireland, but the two principal ones really were El Salvador and South Africa. And we had a particular dialectic growing up, which was that we were drawn into these solidarity movements by day, and we were harassed constantly by the LAPD at night. So it was very easy for people to point out to us the way in which the military occupation and the liberation struggles of other places had an immediate resonance for us, at least when we stopped like physically running away and jumping over fences and sliding under cars and doing those kinds of things. So for me, that dialectic between the Los Angeles Police Department and the liberation struggles in Southern Africa and Central America was a very firm one. And there were people like the late Michael Zinzin who drew together those struggles very much in their own personal activism. Michael had a Friends of the ANC project, and he had the Committee Against Police Abuse project, and they met out of the same office and all the same people and that kind of thing. And I'm often struck by that because in the course of our research, we find these moments where there are organizations and you discover there's all the same people in the same organizations with different names, and you think, why did they do that? And you think, okay, well, as we say in Spanish, cada zapatero a sus zapatos, or cada loco a su locura. Everybody's got their own craziness. As a teenager, though, I was active, but I didn't really have necessarily a consolidated mental framework for understanding these moments and these movements until somebody took me to hear a lecture by Bob Brenner at UCLA on the falling rate of profit. And I exited really excited because I thought, fuck, the revolution is almost here. And I was, I think, 15 or 16 at the time, and I said to the guy who would take me to the lecture, this Trotskyist, John Riley, I said, this is really exciting, man. You know, it's like 6 months, we're going to be in the New Society. He says, oh, yeah, it was really good this year. I said, what? He says, oh, it's an annual lecture. So that was my first introduction to the system that's always dying but never dies. So on the one hand, there were these international movements. On the other hand, there were the cops. There were these intellectual spaces to begin to learn. And I think the final piece for my own personal puzzle was the world and the work of culture in Southern California in the 1970s and 1980s. I came out of that last efflorescence of black arts activity in Southern California. And then I was in a musical world where groups like NWA and Fishbone were really crucial. And we had this wonderful blending of hip-hop music, of rock music, of the Music Machine, this African club that used to be over off of Pico that we would sneak into because I wasn't old enough to be there properly. And it convinced me, it helped me understand the confluence of labor, community, and internationalism. And those are worldviews and orientations that I've tried to preserve. So what the slides are some shots of different elements of what I'm thinking about and working about today, and in particular, the story of Paradon Records, which was a record label founded in the early 1970s by a woman named Barbara Dane, who had been a folk singer, and a man named Irwin Silver, who had worked at Smithsonian, well, not at Smithsonian, at Folkways Records with Mose Ash. And they imported all of these records from liberation movements across the world, as well as radical movements within the United States, Bernice Reagan and GIs who had been radicalized and the like. So for me, that meant a logical extension you know, from the work of the Cuban Revolution with the posters of Ospal into the stuff from Dignidad Rebelde in the Bay Area, the work of Paredon in the 60s and 70s to groups like Zebda and Manu Chao and Quetzal, these kinds of trans-internationalist, immigrant rights and social activism groups, you know, collectives that are as much about political organizing as they are about musical production. Oh, this is a funny one. So when we went, it skipped, but when we went to Dehesha, they found out there was this African-American guy there. So they said, well, you know, we're having a basketball tournament. Would you like to be an honorary coach? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? I said, what's happening? He said, it's the 36th annual Martyrs Brigade basketball tournament. I said, oh shit, okay, just don't put me on the poster. So here we go. This was some of the work that Paredon did. This is a great record, Songs for Life. If you don't know, almost all of Paredon's catalog is online. You can find it at the Smithsonian. And it really charts both some struggles that we had a fairly high degree of familiarity with in the United States, such as Angola. This is a beautiful picture. You can kind of make out that they're reading What Is to Be Done by candlelight, and you can see this kind of intense discussion. This is a Haitian record from the mid-70s, Angola, but also some struggles that most people in the United States were not as cognizant of. The Philippines in the early days, Thailand, Greece, and some other places. So for me, I find that that orientation about labor, culture, and internationalism continues to provide an education as well as an orientation, and that's all I have to say.
And our final speaker today will be Françoise Vergès. Please welcome her.
Well, good morning. Well, thank you to RUTH for inviting me and to Christine and Jordan, and thank you for everyone. We evoke the question of communism in the South, and as you know, I will say I come from a communist family, and I was, effectively, it's an history which has not been written yet. It's usually written from Europe with, you know, the story of Gulag and things like that. But I was also thinking that there is a human history. I saw, you know, women and men together, I mean, escaping patriarchy and the family and certain conformism and belonging to Communist Party allow that. It's not, you know, to idealize that history, but that was also important. And I was also thinking that we are talking about anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and next year will be the anniversary of Bandung. And that was also, you know, the beginning of Afro-Asian solidarity, and followed by the Tricontinental, which headed South America and the Caribbean to that new cartography of solidarity. There is a lot to be said, of course, about the long history of anti-capitalism and anti-colonial struggle. I want to focus today on two related politics: the colonial history of land dispossession and its connection with the loss of rights and the fabrication of landless, propertyless community, how this politic have impacted on citizenship, gender, racialized environmental politics, and new regime of work, and the current politics of land dispossession. In other words, looking at race, class, and gender in the age of Capitalocene, you know, the world system, the capitalist world ecology, which brings a civilization that joins together the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the production of nature as an organic whole. What I'm talking about has happened to the peoples of the Americas, of Asia and Africa, is also happened in Europe, you know, through the destruction of the commons. And there are new forms today. And internationalism was quite often against land dispossession. I got interested in these topics when I met associations from the French Antilles protesting the contamination of their soil by the pesticide, which has been forbidden in the United States in 1976 and in France in 1990, but continue to be used largely in the Antilles. And today, the food, you know, fruit, vegetable, and fish are all contaminated in the Antilles for the generation. You cannot consume the fruit and vegetable in the French Antilles. So I was interested in this, you know, racialized environmental politics, the way that these were still used. So I'm looking also, been looking since at the racialized politics of food production and capitalism, the land grabbing, the monoculture, the multinational, the exploitation of a racialized workforce, the role of scientists and engineers, the criminalization of protest, and the use of the police or the army to repress dissent. And there is a long history there. We can think about sugar, coffee, tobacco, tea, bananas, spice. But we could look also at flowers and cotton. All this has been racialized production. And since the 18th century, the effort of the politics of food production and food consumption has been to create and expand the needs and the rights of the consumer that necessarily hide, mask, and veil the condition of production. Among those made invisible in the world of food production, women have been made even more invisible. Patriarchal colonial powers, presumed that women were not entitled to property. And yet, women already were reproducing the workforce that capitalism needed, reproducing in the feminist sense of giving birth to the slave and denture workers and migrants needed for capitalist production. Without their reproductive work, there would have been no global work market in the 16th to the 19th century capitalism. So I will say 2 words about the colonial politics of food production, 2 words about the cross history of anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism, and finally 2 words about current land grabbing. The racialized food production, and the fabrication of the white consumer. The slave produced coffee, sugar, tobacco, tea, spices, cotton, which all became indispensable to Western life, to social and gender way of being, how you receive socially. You were presenting coffee and sugar and cake to your guest, declaring love, celebrating birth, anniversary, wedding, becoming a man by starting to smoke tobacco, becoming a woman by liking sweet, which is, nothing is natural by the fact that men should smoke and women should eat cake. But anyway, so this was, slowly becoming, by the end of the 17th century, this was really starting to get consolidated in Europe, this division, this gender, even way of, consumption. And in a period when the idea about the universality of rights led to revolution and transformation in Europe, it was necessary to create a distance between the producer and consumer. Slavery and colonialism brought exotic produce to the table, and Western consumer expected them to be available and cheap. Science served the emerging capitalism. In the 18th century, botany, the science of botany, was second to geography as a science founded by the king. So it was important, has been important, to show that fabrication. That was the first point. I mean, I will not really, I just wanted to say that, and I did, for instance, a program in Le Louvre, in the Museum of Le Louvre, visiting Le Louvre, not to look for the slave. You are very few and far between painting, but showing through guided visit when you have the first painting of a man smoking a pipe and the fact that it has penetrated, and this is already a presentation of oneself, a man smoke a pipe, and or when you start to see teapot or coffee pot or sugar bowl, and you see how it has totally penetrated the society, the way of being a civilized person, a social person in Europe, and that rested on the exploitation of an enslaved workforce and the deportation of millions of Africans. But that, effectively, as Voltaire said, the blood in the sugar you consume. But that, in fact, was really solidified. I always, I say quite often in 1791, when the insurrection in Haiti started, as you may know, Saint-Domingue was providing more than half of the sugar consumed in Europe at the time. And of course, with the insurrection, the export of sugar lowered and the price went up. And there were huge demonstrations by revolutionary women in Paris, not to support the Haitian Revolution, but to ask access to cheap sugar. So there was this division already between what you have a right as a consumer, even if you are working class, versus with a producer. So my second point is anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism, and this is the quote of Frantz Fanon, for the colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is the first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. Land, was a fundamental object of colonial racial conflict and violence. Land dispossession was a tool of the colonial power. First, claimed that local property rights are not legitimate. Second, seize land. Third, claimed that landlessness deprived individuals of basic rights and opened the way for further loss of rights. I want to just give you an example of 19th century that traced the itinerary of repression, use of army, land dispossession, insurrection, and alliance. In 1871, as you know, there was a Paris Commune, the great proletarian insurrection. It was crushed in May by the French Republican troops. What is less well known is that in March 1871, Mohammed el-Hajj al-Mokrani had launched the greatest insurrection since the defeat of Abdelkader in Algeria. The insurrection was against the policy of land dispossession, heavy taxes, and the famine which had been provoked by the seizure of wheat by the French government to feed their troops. 500,000 men and women joined the armed insurrection in the east of Algeria. When the Commune was crushed, troops were moved to Algeria, and they burned villages and crops, they looted, they raped. They finally crushed the insurrection in January 1872. In France, communards were condemned to exile, some to Algeria, but the majority to New Caledonia, which had become a French colony in 1854. And other Algerians also were sent to the same prison in France, and the communards for the first time met colonized people. And they were also condemned to exile to New Caledonia, and they traveled to New Caledonia in the same ship than the communards, even though in most of the image, what we notice are the communards. We never knew that in the same ship you had the Algerian men, you know. And some died because they were afraid that they were fed pork, and they did not know, and nobody could talk with them. And you have still the beginning of the memoir by communards saying that they were discovering colonialism. They had not known that their country was doing that. So their proletarian revolution met anti-colonial insurrection. So they were sent, as I say, so in the meantime, the land of the Algerian tribe which had, resisted were seized. 500,000 hectares were taken to be given to thousands of families from Alsace-Lorraine who had fled the Prussian and to workers condemned to exile. Each male settler received 300 hectares. So it was also, reinforcing the question of land, the patriarchy, the relation to who can be, the owner of land is always a man, whether it's white. And the Algerians who had been landowners were transformed into agricultural workers. In one night, 300 tribes lost their land in Algeria. The Algerians were also condemned to pay 3 billion francs, which was the exact amount that the French government had been condemned to pay by the Prussian people. Excuse me. So, in a way, the war that was launched in Europe, the debt was paid by the colonized. The price was. Monoculture was imposed in Algeria. Forest was destroyed to serve the needs of French capitalism. So they arrived in New Caledonia, as I say, where you had, it was also land dispossession. And they arrived by the end of 1872. In 1878, there was a Kanak insurrection against land dispossession again, which was crushed again by the French troop. And the Kanak leader at High was decapitated and his hands sent to the Museum of Natural History in Paris to study Kanak inferiority. A vast amount of land was confiscated and taxes were imposed. By 1880s, more than 90% of the Kanak land had been given to settlers. And reservations were created and forced labor was instituted. But we could follow that, we could still follow that route, that in 1896, some of the people who had been sent on exile were forcibly drafted in the colonial troop, which were sent to conquer Madagascar, where the first decision of the colonial power, when they had defeated the monarchy, was to seize land and impose a regime of forced labor. So crushing the Paris Commune was also about disciplining the French working class, reconfiguring French capitalism. It was, the beginning of the Third Republic. And crushing anti-colonial insurrection, destroying social and cultural organization, transforming also revolutionaries and the poor into white slater, whitening effectively the working class and the poor people, made into white with rights and privilege associated to their skin color. The Republic at home racialized politics abroad. And of course, this was not a French case. This was all over Europe, done by all the Europeans. This policy drew a global color line and created a white man world, which was free against the brown people, the men of color, and free. The global organization of a mobile, racialized, and gender workforce, inaugurated with the slave trade, continued to influence post-slavery politics, organization of the global workforce. Women and men were trafficked around the world on south-south route from India, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam to other colonies, sent to South Africa, other, Vietnamese sent to New Caledonia, Indians sent to South Africa to work on plantation in the mine and drafted in the army. Encouraging monoculture meant looking for the best soil varietal and destroying biodiversity. Science was serving capitalism, also finding new pesticide and insecticide. It gave a central role to the Western scientist and engineer, following the priest and the soldier. And my third point is, what is today? Okay, I wanted, to have this quote by the South African freedom fighter, the people who were born with the ANC, especially about the question of land dispossession and the fact that land has not been distributed after the end of apartheid and remain a very source of conflict in South Africa. The new politic of land dispossession means a reinforced relation between science and agribusiness, finding the genome of plants today, creating new species, new pesticide and insecticide, using military technologies, the drone which go around to find, where you should. New policy of food production and food consumption. On the one hand, you will have healthy food and drink. We want to be sure we give good food to our children, versus effectively unhealthy food and drinks for the poor everywhere in the world. Attack on women's rights and the rights of, First Nation, and also the invention of green capitalism. And since the food crisis of 2008, which, as we know, was artificially created by state speculation, government, hedge fund, multinational, have launched new policy of land grabbing. Most governments have accepted to review laws about land property. I will just give you some, facts. Based on satellite imagery, the Global Agroecological Assessment has provided today a survey of global agricultural potential, which shows that 80% of the world reserve agricultural land is in Africa and South America. And there is a new concept now of available, idle, waste land that can be effectively, which can echo the new concept of terra nullius. There is nobody there, we can go. More than 4 million of hectares in Brazil, 30 million in Paraguay are already in foreign land. In 2008, Gulf firms created an Islamic investment fund, Agri-Capital, and purchased land internationally to produce food and to fund research in biotechnology. According to 2009 data, more than 83 million hectares, especially in Africa, have been rented or sold to foreign investors in Madagascar, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, in Sudan. The Abu Dhabi Fund for Development has been buying land in Kazakhstan and Pakistan. China has bought, more than 50% of farmland in Laos. Kuwait and Qatar have been buying fields in Cambodia and land from palm oil in Kenya. Sudan has land more than, 1 million hectares of its arable land. And Saudi Arabia is negotiating with Egypt, Turkey, Ukraine to rent farms. So we see it's absolutely everywhere. South Korea has been buying in Madagascar with South African labor, importing South African labor in Madagascar. So still, the circulation of, workforce. And buying land also to Mongolia. 70% of the land grabbing in Africa is by hedge fund. And multinationals like Cargill, Monsanto, Nestle, Walmart, Daewoo, and Dreyfus are among the most aggressive buyers. 4 multinationals dominate the grain market, and green capitalism and financial control of research and biodiversity demonstrate that a lot is at stake in the new politics of dispossession and colonization. Recently, the fund manager of Emerging Capital, a private equity company, announced, and I quote, "Africa is once again open for business." Remember Berlin. As early as 1999, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development reported, and I quote, "The potential for highly profitable foreign investment in Africa is enormous." The attractiveness of farmland in Africa is twofold. First, it's highly fertile in numerous regions, and second, is incredibly inexpensive, because effectively Africans do not own land. They don't know what is property. So food production, oil price, climate change, gender inequality, land grabbing combine to create a system that is dominated by a few powerful company and government, and in which NATO has played a fundamental role. The capitalist agricultural model is about class, race, and gender, and land grabbing is targeting countries of the South. Poor farmers' rights are being ignored, and the majority of the 500 million of agricultural workers are in the South. In this reconfiguration, women are the most vulnerable. Though they produce half of the food consumed in the world, they prepare it, they cook it, their rights are not recognized, and quite often green politics target them. They constitute 43% of the labor force, but only 2% are landowners. Racial capitalism is gendered. Anti-colonial resistance was very much about, against land grabbing. Colonized understood the link the colonial power was making between land dispossession, loss of right, gender, the destruction of social and cultural organization, and the opposition of monoculture to serve the need of Western consumer. As Kanak anti-colonial leader Jean-Marie Djibaou declared, the loss of land has been a tragedy for its people. He had contributed to the alienation, to the loss of history, of identity. Resistance to current gender and racialized politics of land dispossession are again international. But there is more to do. There is a new frontier, we can say, of dispossession that we are starting just to look at, but is really the new frontier for multinational agribusiness and science and military technology. Is the submarine resources, looking at the sea again as a new place to dispossess people. So expanding maritime empire in which science and the military go hand in hand to effectively dispossess people from the resources that the sea has in the name of this belongs to the world and to humanity. So there is, a lot to be done. And this, of course, could be, but I wanted to finish with Cabral, which, as you know, was an agronomist. Tell no lies, expose lies whenever they are told, mask no difficulty, mistake and failure, claim no easy victories. Thank you.
By my clock, I think we have about 45 minutes for questions. And I'll start off. I won't ask too much. But I wanted to start off with one question. And that, I think all of your work and papers today have brought up really fascinating ways in which particular struggles speak to a broader global condition. And I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit the question of translating these local struggles on a global scale. I'm thinking about Hakim's work, but also Danny's on third worldism, and also Françoise very brilliantly in her paper today brings this up. So the local to global, but also how you translate a global analysis into speak to local conditions. I think in some ways that quote from the South African freedom fighters, maybe I just need to keep rereading that. There's a lot there. But if you could speak more broadly to those questions, then we'll open it up to everyone in the audience.
I could maybe say one thing about that, which is, I guess, a question for us and the audience as well. When I have the opportunity to listen about these other moments, I'm struck by how detailed individuals' knowledge was as a precondition of being part of these revolutionary movements. That people had to know where they could and couldn't go. I mean, we spoke a little bit about this last night, that people were taking their lives in their hands all of the time. And so the stakes were quite high about knowing where you could go and when, how to get there, and being able to pass yourself off as belonging in different contexts. Where in Cardiff you could go and where you couldn't. The same for Alabama, the same for Sacramento, all kinds of different cartographies of violence and security. And I'm struck by the contrast between that and the kind of rhetoric of contemporary cosmopolitanism. And so I know there's a lot of work right now about, in particular, kind of Afro-cosmopolitanism. And I'm curious to get a sense of how antagonistic internationalism and cosmopolitanism are as concepts. I don't know if that makes sense as a question.
The question was, how do we translate local to global and global to local? Through a lot of effort. And the finding, I think also for what Daniel was showing, it can also circulate by absolutely different means. There is not one way, it's not just by text, it can be really by song, poetry. But the idea is absolutely to connect, to understand how all our lives are absolutely implicated by the same system, and that expose the lies, and really, so I think it's a constant work, and there is no end to it. There is a constant selection and reselection, as Ruti was saying, of what is going on and who are the people together. I'm struck, in this question, how women are totally invisible in this question. I mean, you look at things and and you see, I couldn't find a quote by a woman. I found a quote by Françoise Vergès, the freedom fighter, I mean, I love them, that's not the point. But, we don't hear them. We don't hear them. And I do think that's part also of bringing that. I suppose that today we have to revigorate a new alliance between autochthonous people, women's rights, and people in the North.
Okay, well, perhaps I can add something a little bit different, because I think that one of the key issues for those who are concerned, not just to interpret the world, but to change it, is that we have a broad summation of experience. So I understand theory as the summation of experience. So what then is important is, how do we sum up the experience of not just what is local, but what is international, what is global, in order to inform whatever it is we're doing locally, we're doing nationally, and so on. So that summation of what does the 20th century show us? What does the 20th century teach us about how we organize, what the orientation of our struggles are, where there were victories, where were there defeats, and so on. So I think that's extremely important, and obviously as a historian I try to do some of that work, but I think that's work for all of us who are concerned, that we want things which can guide us. We don't want to just be, oh, let's just try something. I mean, we can do that, but it's good to do that, but we need it to be also informed by our own experience and the experience of others. So I think that's where this international experience can have a profound effect on our activism, our activity locally, nationally, and so on.
In the interest of time, I will hand things over. Are there questions for our panel from the audience?
Greetings, good morning. Thank you all, fantastic presentations. I wanted to ask a question about, you had shown the slide of the quotation from the South African economic freedom fighters. And from my understanding, this is a relatively new political party in South Africa, involved with people who had been in the youth wing of the ANC. And that most recently, in the most recent election, they had won 5% of the national vote. And one of their major demands that is getting a lot of traction is to claim the land without any kind of compensation to the people who had previously owned it, and as you're saying, had dispossessed people of it. A question that I have is that it seems like the economic freedom fighters and other more youth-led parts of international anti-colonial movements seem to have a bit of a gap between what their radical demands are and then also a sense of how to practically carry out those demands. So very specific policies, very specific ways that they can include people in a robust sense of how to actually transform society they're in. And it seems like that opens up a larger question of, within movements, that we have generational gaps. So the youth wing of the ANC forging their own road right now, not having as much of a rootedness as, say, older members of the ANC. Or you could look at the Communist Party, Hakim bringing up this wide range of struggle happening in Harlem, in New York City, a lot of people in the CP being in their early 20s. But I think that looking at past struggles, it seemed like people had a much more clarified sense of how to actually engage in political activity instead of it being just on the realm of rhetoric. And on the point of the lack of women's histories in our revolutionary histories, I'm struck by how Barbara Dane, who was briefly mentioned, or someone like Louise Bryant in Harlem, who would work with Langston Hughes to bring cultural spaces of radicals and revolutionaries coming together, that it's important to see cultural spaces, music, poetry, as part of revolutionary reproduction. And so I wonder if y'all could speak on that a bit. Thanks.
I can say something just about Barbara very briefly, which is, I think, her role was very important as both, how to put it, as a cultural producer and as a recording musician. She had an exceptional ability to work with musicians to help them produce work that would be technically sophisticated enough to be recordable and distributable, because Paradón was bringing people into the United States, and they were also getting tapes. For instance, the records from Thailand were recorded in the jungle. People fled after the massacre at Thammasat University. So there was a technical expertise as well as a performing experience. So she had an ability to understand people's demands for creative control, but also the necessities of production, of recording things so that they would hold up and could be listenable. So I think that it's important to acknowledge the depth of expertise that people had in various different experiential elements of their life and how those were constitutive of their revolutionary praxis. That's, I guess, a lot of fancy words, but essentially, it's a way of saying that people made the road by walking. And I think that, another artist who I think is extraordinary to think about in that context is Elizabeth Catlett. Elizabeth Catlett's art is so important for so many different approaches to revolutionary cultural organizing. There's the angle of Mexico coming out of the muralist movement, and all of the work that does around U.S. Latino and U.S. African struggles. There's her work from 48 and 49 on this series on the Negro woman, which is amazing in terms of both its historical breadth and its organizational specificity. But these are people who were simultaneously inside political organizing, political formations, but also immersed in the world of production, in this case, prints or records. So I think that one of the difficulties for the current moment is that we're still grappling, I think, with whether or not the technologies that are proliferating today allow us new means of organizing and of creating and distributing knowledge. This is a part of the argument about coming out of the Arab Spring, or if the particular form of various digital medias is changing the way we relate to each other as human beings enough so that it's a problem for us as revolutionary activists. And I think we had a little bit of that conversation yesterday, and I really don't know the answer. I think it's a really crucial question because things are circulating in different ways, and they, at the same time, they are mobilizing people, but they demobilize people at the same time in ways that I don't think radio or posters or even film did. So I think that's my response to the point that you raised.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think one thing reflecting on South Africa is if we go back in history to the time of the Freedom Charter, which was, what, 60 years ago, the question of land was central to that charter, as well as the question of how the country was governed, the economic orientation, and so on. So I think that one of the difficulties with the struggle is that these principles which are enshrined in the Freedom Charter haven't actually been implemented. And if those who are in office are not implementing what was drawn up 50, 60 years ago, then clearly there's going to be great dissatisfaction and new organizations and so on are going to be formed, which revisit these important questions and so on. It's interesting to compare South Africa with Zimbabwe, where there's a government which is, on the face of it, trying to do something about the land question, but has been prevented from implementing what it wishes to implement by the government of this country and the government of the country that I live in. And in fact, at the end of the struggle for liberation in Zimbabwe, the Lancaster House Agreement that was drawn up in London in 1979 specifically prohibited the government and people of Zimbabwe from solving the land question without the, should we say, the intervention of Anglo-US imperialism. So that struggle has taken a particular form in Zimbabwe, and of course, as we know, also the demonization of the government of Zimbabwe, its president, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting how this question of land plays out in different places at different times. The question of, just on the question of women, or of gender and women, if I can put it that way. I know when I was looking at the work to do with the Communist International and Africa, what struck me was that many of those women who were key players were completely unknown. In fact, you wouldn't find them in archival material and so on. Just to give you one example, one of the key women was a woman called Frida Schiff. Has anybody heard of Frida Schiff? No. Okay. Well, Frida Schiff was George Padmore's friend. Sometimes she was called George Padmore's wife. Actually, he had a wife here in the US. But Frida Schiff was an Austrian woman who was also George Padmore's wife, particularly during the time he was in Germany. She was a comrade activist. She worked producing Negro Worker. She did all kinds of things, but nobody's ever heard of her. She's essentially not written out of history, not even written into history. So it's often difficult because in the archives and elsewhere, it's often a male voice or a male pen or whatever that is writing and presenting. And so it's quite possible that anyway, much of history is lost. And I think we all have a responsibility to try and deal with that question. Just very briefly on, actually, no, I won't deal with that question. I've said enough.
I just want to say 2 words about that quote. I want to, they talk about slavery, And that is new in South Africa. It's really new. I mean, quite often when the South African narrative forgot that there had been slavery in South Africa, they thought that, you know, the question of race started with apartheid, but the matrix was already there with slavery in Cape Town and elsewhere. So there is also, I mean, what I think is interesting in this city, the citation by this new group is effectively that they are tracing a new map of the struggle, also a new history of the struggle in South Africa, and connected with something that was, because otherwise apartheid, like everything started and had, you know, started with apartheid, ended with the end of apartheid. And that, you know, you have already dispossession, inequality inscribed before apartheid, with colonization, with colonialism of South Africa and slavery. That's one thing. The other thing also, I think what is interesting is that it's not just about freedom. What they say is economic freedom. And what is economic freedom is a question of equality. So it's no longer just reappropriating the country, you know, the land, the territory. But what do you do then with the territory? So it's, you know, it's not just effectively anti-colonial struggle as just freedom. It's also now the question of equality. And then, of course, women and so on are raised. And so the question is not a generational gap, is that a part of the ANC has sided with the neoliberal economic system. And so there is within the ANC an ideological and political struggle. And so I will not call it a generational gap, because you do have older companion of the ANC, and I'm thinking of Cathedra, who do think that what the economic freedom fighters are doing, perhaps not agreeing with everything, but it's absolutely, yes, necessary to ask that question today in South Africa. And the question of women, well, I'd rather not get started with that.
Just a couple of things. But before I ask my questions, I just have to correct something. At the ASA, I wasn't telling people not to talk about themselves. What I was doing, though, was trying to get, as a moderator, trying to get people from the audience not to use the occasion to talk about their work rather than what was at hand. So now I'm going to talk about my work. I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna do that. Actually, I'm not going to do that. But it's important because, you know, it's interesting. I sort of had two comments and a couple of questions. These are great presentations. And Danny, but everything, I mean, I was living with you, you know, through this whole process. And just a couple of things. One is I'm so glad Françoise's presentation was so brilliant, and he reminded us of the importance of the commons, of recognizing that what we think of as repossession is considered the criminal act, when in fact dispossession was the criminal act. And just that basic reminder is so fundamental as a way to develop a kind of politics that sort of transcends legality in a sense, or understands what legality is really about, you know? And this is exactly what Ruthie was talking about last night. How do we even accept this notion that imprisonment or private property are kind of naturalized, you know? So I just really want to thank you for that. And I want to come back to this question of the Communist Party and two things, women and the local international. So, and this is a question for Hakim, given all the research you've done, I mean, would you agree that part of the invisibility of women is also the actual outright suppression? In other words, the ground upon which communism emerges is the third international, is the ground upon which the second international emerges, which is like the first international. That is, that it's not an accident that Claudia Jones would write a famous article about the neglect of Negro women, because in fact, just to try to get a voice, why do we have to work so hard to find the voices? Well, we know why. Partly because of the fact that the Communist International, like all internationals, as much as they might have spoken about the woman question, the fact that it was a question is part of the issue. So if you take the South African Communist Party and its formation, it's not an accident that, whatever the racial politics of it being a white party that, as you know, which became a black party, that the initial recruits were people who came out of the missionary schools, and these were men. And so you just take it for granted that, who is the cadre that emerges, even though you may have these amazing women involved, the gendered culture on the ground made it very difficult for women to participate. So I wanted you to talk about what you found in the archives, and if you find, like, in different communist parties and different relationships, international differences in terms of that relationship. And actually, that actually embeds my other question, which was really about the way the local shapes those communist parties and how important that is. Because again, South Africa is interesting because there was a conception of self-determination long before the so-called Negro or Native national question, and it comes out of Ethiopianism, comes out of the church, comes out of other forms of practice. And I guess my question is, if this is true, what impact have those local cultures had on shaping the Communist International, or attempted to shape the Communist International, and in fact failed? So that's my.
Okay. Okay, I think those are very interesting questions. Just to maybe take the second question first. I mean, the book isn't titled Pan-Africanism and Communism for no reason, as it were, because the whole issue and orientation of what Pan-Africanism was about in that period, which of course did include issues of self-determination, obviously clearly the agency of Africans in their own liberation, the idea that we are our own liberators and so on, and a whole range of related issues, undoubtedly had an impact on the Communist International and the way it took up this question of African liberation. The weight and influence of Garveyism and the UNIA, for example, would be the obvious illustration of that. And of course, probably the way that the question of African American liberation, the Black Belt thesis and so on, I would say clearly shows the influence of the kind of wider Pan-African movements and struggles and so on. I mean, I think in the South African case, it's true that we find, and in other parts of Africa, we find the idea of self-determination developing in some cases in the early 19th century, as early as that in places like Sierra Leone and so on. But it's perhaps, I think what communism perhaps brings to it is methods of struggle, ways of analyzing, obviously the nature of capitalism, the nature of imperialism, who are the key forces in that struggle and so on, the question of alliances and so on. And obviously in those movements which were, as you know, which were active in South Africa, the ANC, ICU and so on, communists also played a leading role, particularly in the early 1920s, before they were ejected or expelled from those movements. So I think there's a coming together of different traditions during this period, and this really is a period of Pan-Africanism and communism, of these different traditions coming together for this particular period of time, which is for me was especially interesting to look at how that worked. In the other question, which is the question about women, I mean, this, again, it plays out slightly differently in different parts of the world. If we take places like metropolitan countries like Britain or France, for example, the vast majority of Africans, people of African origin in Britain or France at that time were men, were males, were migrants of one sort or another, possibly students or possibly seafarers or other working people where women were in the minority. So we wouldn't be surprised to find that African communists in those areas were mainly male. In other countries, obviously like the US or perhaps South Africa, there the situation is a bit different. And it's clear that, to me anyway, that this question was taken up. I mean, in South Africa, there were women's organizations, there were women organizers. They are, in the early period, perhaps not as prominent or as many as there were male organizers, but they certainly existed. But I think that the question of liberation of women was not developed, was not articulated sufficiently in that period. I mean, we're looking back with the gaze of the 21st century. We have views on these things which differ from the way people looked at these questions in the 1920s. I think for the majority of activists, as you mentioned, one of the key considerations was how this question of African liberation was going to be taken up and resolved in general. That this was what was being underestimated in the US, in South Africa, in Britain, in Cuba, wherever it might be. And that was the concentration, if you like, not the question of women or anyway other questions. So I think it's something which was conditioned by the context and circumstances of the time. We can be critical of it, or we can point out this was a weakness, but I think it's something which just emerged, from that period. And as we see in a later period, these things are righted and so on. What was important to me about the Communist International and those African communists was they took up these issues for solution in a way that others were not doing at that period. And I think that's something that needs to be reflected on. And in this summation, which I talked about earlier, we look at the lessons, the politics of the 20th century. This has to be included. And we draw the appropriate conclusions from including all these important efforts to find solutions to these key questions.
Thank you. I think effectively this question of the commons, grabbing back to talk like that, of this notion, it's extremely important. And it's both the vernacular tradition of the commons and today all the question of polyculturalism, agriculturalism, and the question of practices of conservation among autochthonous people. I mean, that's really great. I mean, there is a source to work, but it really need to be revigorated. I do think that the new form of food production and food consumption are a kind of war against non-white people, not just in terms, land of disposition, but I said the consequence on health, social, cultural organization. It's absolutely the question of water, as we know all around the world, is absolutely a very 75% of humanity does not have access to, clean water. So it's really like the reorganization today of the, really of a new color line, which is not just about rights, but it's really deeply about the question of the body and health and a racialized and gendered body.
Can I just follow? One thing pops in my head hearing you talk. When my father graduated from UCLA in 1963, he's my height, in between 6'1" and 6'2". He weighed 123 pounds. And he was in the habit in those days of actually picking wild greens that grew in vacant lots in Watts, as well as boosting oranges off of people's trees throughout LA. And that was true for white Angelenos as well as black Angelenos, actually. Took a while to extract that from my mother, who doesn't like cooked vegetables, but she would cop to it too eventually. And so I do think it's exceptionally and interesting that in the case of the United States, certainly, poverty was associated with being exceptionally thin, with that kind of malnutrition. And if you look at the photograph from Cardiff, you're struck by how gaunt working class people were at the early part of the last century. And the physiology has been transformed. And I do think that that's a form of warfare. It has to be said as such.
We can take 3 questions at a time.
Okay.
Because we're running short on time.
Okay, so my question real quick is, thank you so much for all your work. This goes to Daniel. And I'm thinking about culture production, right? From blues to Chicano teatro to, we take these forms as being created by chance, right? But if you look at a lot of disruptions from the Watts riots to, 1992 rebellion, right? It opens up when this disruption opens up for artistic creation, right? From oppressed communities. And I wanted to ask you this question in regards to, a lot of people write about this, how it's just by chance, right? And so we have these forms of, but again, from jazz to teatro, that really become forms of opposition, right, to oppression. And I wanted you to talk about how I really feel like, and it's hard to prove, right, how this isn't happening by chance, right? But it's a strategic response from oppressed communities. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, and going back and connecting, the music that you're talking about, and then just these, massive, movements that happen at these times.
Well, just a really short comment on that, because I think others in the room will have really interesting perspectives on this. Many of the crucial cultural movements that we've seen in proliferate in the United States were the function of working class people's successful seizure of at least enough of the production process to generate a certain amount of leisure time. That's true of the 1950s in San Francisco, where the seizure of the docks led to the freedom that proliferated in the poetry of people like Bob Kaufman and others. And it's certainly true of the 1960s, and it's true after a fashion, even in the turn of the century moment. I think one of the challenges that we find today is that people have less time. The amount of time that working class people have is probably less than it's been for a long, long time. I mean, people are constantly hopping from job to job. They have no sense of when they're going to be working or not working. So doing something like meeting with somebody to play music in your garage, it's much more difficult than it was in 1977. So all I would say is that you point out to the way we think about these huge disruptive radicalizing events is crucial. I think the day-to-day ability to seize enough free time to connect to other people in person is really the crucial one.
Actually, I was standing here, I was noticing the quotation behind you, and I just read it in the book that I'm reading right now, which is Vijay Prasad's The Darker Nations. And I think it's interesting where it's situated in that book, and maybe where it's situated in history, which is that it comes at the end of his part 1, where he's talking about these radical international solidarities launched with the meeting at Bandung, and then right before part 2, where it's actually about the difficulties, mistakes, and failures, and I'd say the attacks and appropriations of national liberation movements. So connecting it to a conversation yesterday evening, it seems like that was a moment of reorganizing racial regimes. And this leads me to my question, which is to Françoise. I feel like this is another moment of sort of reorganizing racial and ideological regimes, particularly around climate. And you talked about the sea as a new frontier of investment. And I think it's really interesting that oceans were left out of the 12 points that in the climate summit where they're going to focus, yet agriculture was included. And agriculture is included, and at the same time, there's this launch for this Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, which La Via Campesina and many community organizations have come out against, because they see this actually as a way for capital investment, not actually to support small farmers. So it seems to me that both the exclusion from the climate movement and the inclusion are both serving the same purpose here, which is capital expansion. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the issues you were discussing, but related to climate specifically and how it's being used.
Before you answer that, there's another question over here. That'll be, I think, our final question.
So my question has to do with, I'm thinking a little bit or a lot about the question of the archival horizons in which we work in, and the narrative that I've been hearing, which is very valid and problematic, which is the absence or the relative invisibility of women in the Black radical tradition. And I would just like to I just pose a question about might that narrative not be turned around or disrupted if we look at the Black radical tradition of anti-colonial activism, anti-slavery activism in the early times of the Black radical tradition, which was under slavery, where we know that women were some of the fiercest guerrilla warriors, they were the fiercest Maroons, and we have these stories in literature, in oral history, oral memory, and I'm just wondering if it might not be a question of working in another, expanding the archival horizon in which we're working, because we do have stories such as the story of Nanny, such as the Maroon warrior Solitude, who is a very big presence on the island of Guadeloupe. So that's my question.
Yes.
One final question.
Sure. My question is, well, Francois and for brother wrote about Pan-Africanism and the communist movement. Presently, I would say I'm happy that this conference is happening because it combined two things that normally separated the issue of racism or capitalism and colonialism. But I think that the forces that are in the I would say, the front of the struggle right now is in Latin America. And meanwhile, we're discussing the history, and I think it's important, I think that there are movements that are involved in this struggle right now that needs to be discussed, the relevance of those historical experiences, what we have learned, and how it gets applied in this moment. And I raise the issue that the Afro-descendant movement and the indigenous movement gained some very important victory with the Durban process that forced most of the government around the world to recognize the issue of colonialism and enslavement as crime against humanity, but also to deal with the issue of the racialization of most of the population in our region. And I raise that in Brazil, for example, the people who are on the ground fighting for anti-capitalism is the social black movement and indigenous movement who question the issue of land with the Quilombolas and women in the leadership of that and those movements challenging the nature, and that Dilma Rousseff only won the election last 2 Sundays ago because that movement and the poor people voted for them based on that agenda. I know that elite is even accusing them of saying, how do you make the poor and the blacks define who wins the election in this country? The same thing happened for Bolivia, and the same thing happened with Evo and Ecuador. So I just want to call our attention that the both Pan-Africanism and the discussion of anti-capitalism, sometimes we have to be beyond the ideological definition of movement to see what's happening on the ground, because these are the forces that are challenging the form of neoliberalism and capitalism, and for the first time recognized by forces injecting the question of racialized democracy and questioning the nature of Eurocentric democracy for Latin America. I'd like to hear your comments about how you see those movements. And for Francois, where the issue of mestizaje, that you know you have done a lot of work, mestizaje, the ideological concept of denying racial tension or racial discrimination. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. I mean, the last question about the importance of struggles in Latin America and so on, and the victories that have been achieved there recently are extremely important. All victories internationally are important, or equally important, we could say. So yes, I mean, clearly those are extremely important, and we need to, there needs to be, you know, summation of those struggles as well. What has led to victory and so on. So I don't necessarily have anything to add to what the questioner himself presented, other than to say the question of the struggle against Eurocentrism, to me, is a struggle that needs to be taken up everywhere, not just outside of Europe, but also inside Europe. That's a very, very important question, because it's really a question of fighting for the new against the old. It's fighting for a new world, new society, and so on, and with, we could say, modern definitions of everything. And in that regard, I should say that the communism I'm talked about in my book is the old communism. It's the communism of the early part of the 20th century. It's not the communism of the 21st century. Because the communism of the 21st century has to deal with the problems of the 21st century. We're not dealing with the problems of the 1920s and 1930s. So it's, I'm not saying they're completely unrelated, but it's different. You know, there's a German gentleman who said, our theory is not a dogma, it's a guide to action. It's not, you know, it's no good repeating what somebody said in 1923. That's no use to anybody. So those new definitions are part of the struggle against Eurocentrism, you could say, of dealing with the problems which, you know, which confront us today, which I think are extremely important. And of course, we also have to look at the struggles and the victories as well as the defeats in Africa. I know people keep referring to some Arab Spring. I don't know where this place is, because as far as I understand it, these struggles took place in the African continent. Most of them, most important ones in Tunisia and in Egypt, and so on. So again, there's also victories, but also defeats there that have to be summed up. What is going on? What's the role of the big powers, the intervention, and so on. So these are pressing questions. I know you guys in this continent, anyway, maybe think things that happen in this continent are more important, but those of us in other parts of the world have a more internationalist perspective on these questions. On the question of, just going back on the question of women, I mean, this is a very, very important issue. I think one thing about the archives is that we can't become kind of slaves to the archives, as it were. You know, we also have to interpret, as it were, and gather our history from, you know, from all the sources, you know, that, as is fairly obvious. So I think that's, you know, extremely important. And sometimes those sources are living sources as well as dead ones or written ones and so on. And I'd just like to say, because I didn't have a chance before, and I hope you'll excuse me, that in writing my book, which took about 10 years in all, a number of people were of great assistance to me. And two of those people are in the audience today. I haven't had a chance to thank them publicly, and I'd just like to just take a moment to do that, because I know we have many illustrious guests in the audience, but we have two that are very dear to me. They're both sitting at the back of the audience. They're not easily embarrassed, so I can point to them. One is Mary Louise Patterson, who's the daughter of William L. Patterson, who I mentioned earlier. So, Mary Lou was very, very helpful to me in my research, and sitting next to her is a very youthful-looking Louise Merriweather, who was also a great assistance to me. And I'd just like to say also on the question of women, if we look in different areas, in Britain, for example, the earliest Pan-African organization that we know of, named organization, was called the Sons of Africa. That organization was formed in about 1787. It was an organization which campaigned for the rights of Africans against enslavement and so on. It was an enlightened, very, very enlightened organization. Its leader, one of its leaders was a man called Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano was also a member of the London Corresponding Society, which was one of the first revolutionary organizations in Britain in the 18th century. And that organization had the view that what was of importance was that you fight for the rights of all. If you fight for the rights of one section of the people, you fight for the rights of all sections. And that was a very advanced position. Some people today don't have that position, unfortunately.
Very quickly. The question of the climate, how has been used. Of course, I mean, there is all this debate, about how all this talk about the Anthropocene is in fact bad history. It shows that it's, humans have been mean to the earth, and if they were starting to be good and love the earth, things will, work again. And so on others, of course, people are saying, but we have to look at capital. No, it's not humanity like that. It's abstract things and how it has been targeting what we call nature from the beginning. There is environmental history of slavery. I mean, it does not start with the 20th century. It starts like that. You had to cut entire forests to build slave ships, and you have to destroy entire forests to have sugarcane field and tobacco field and cotton field. So the question of transformation of the territory and where you build the port and where you build the road and where you build a city. I mean, we live in the world which has been shaped, a cartography which has been shaped by these different movements. So we have to look at how this question of dispossession and creation of racial regime went along very early of the beginning of capitalism altogether. So, and as you do know, the way climate change has been used is like as if poor people are bad ecologists, They don't know better. And so, for example, in Madagascar, in Africa, and I suppose also in South America, they are not, we have to create natural park to protect biodiversity because these people don't know how to respect monkeys and birds. And that, as we do know, the history of natural park is deeply connected with the history of imperialism. And so how do we reconcile all this together? And so I agree that effectively, as I was saying, there is a connection between indigenous rights re-emerging, the question of also vernacular practice, the anti-colonial struggle, the anti-capitalist struggle, which constitute today a source, an incredible library to effectively think what is happening to us today. And I would just want to say two other things. I mean, I think the sea, as we know, it was extremely important for imperialism to control the sea and the navy. And we don't pay attention not that much about the sea anymore, We just look at the air and the people and the planes which are bombing, and it's true, it's important. But the sea is incredible frontier today for the racial capitalism. It's incredible the way, that, but you find that information only on the with the army. Even, for instance, the Ministry of Agriculture will not, I don't even know if they know what's happening in the military and science. Incredibly, like going for that new frontier. Not so much we look, like, okay, satellite or sand and so on, and we want to colonize Mars or whatever. This is right there, it's happening. Much more, and so the colonization. And to end up, I wanted, even us to think about that notion of colonization, how it remained absolutely very strong I mean, there is a state in the world which uses the term of colonization, colony, like in total impunity. And it is Israel. I mean, even though you have a consensus, even among the United Nations, that colonization, I mean, the declaration in 1948, that, you know, self-determination was a right, and colonization had become a bad word. And you don't, I mean, you do it, but you don't say it anymore. And this is the only place. So that's one, the strength of the notion of colonization, how it's absolutely intimately connected with racial capitalism. So what are the new politics, the new anti-colonial politics, the new politics of decolonization also? What are the new forms of decolonization? What is the new vocabulary of decolonization that have to be articulated with this new emergence and the new question? And as you were saying, the connection between South America and Africa and Asia. Asia, Asia, you know, with the million of farmers and peasants over there that are absolutely, so there is something also again about the peasantry that, and that if it is articulated, so the question of indigenous rights. So I do think there is, you know, and of course, and the fact that women are constituting practically half of the people working in agriculture and are totally invisible. We don't even, you know, in the image that we see about the destruction of nature, you see children or men, but you don't see so much, you know, the question. So I do think, I mean, the articulation. And the other, I mean, mestiçage, what is the new word for that? Is multiculturalism. You know, it's a new, but just little thing. I mean, it was articulated different during different, you know, imperial regime. So the way it was articulated in the French colonial empire was not exactly the same than in the Portuguese empire or in the Dutch empire. So there is also, you know, a more, we have to, you know, clarify what we're talking and what moment and things like that. So it was articulated differently. Because in fact, in the French colonial empire, the French saw the mestiçage as much more dangerous than, you know, being black or Indian for different reasons. Their fear was that these people could become French. So it's just a little remark.
I know we're pressed for time. I just want to say that I really appreciate the comment about Latin America because it made me feel so optimistic. You know, one of the things that's happening now in response to the public health crisis, one element of the public health crisis in West Africa, the United States has sent its army, the Cubans have sent their doctors, Bob Geldof has made a record. So I feel sort of like we're headed back into the 1980s, which was a political time that I was absolutely convinced the world revolution was right around the corner. So I think those are some helpful elements of the current conjuncture, and it shows that those of us in the Western Hemisphere have a positive material contribution to make to the old world.
Please join me in thanking the panel for very insightful discussion.